Godfather. Pulled up to the scene in a 65 Bentley, dripped in Brioni, China doll with me, looking like a supermodel. Oh, what a feeling. 25 years old, 25 million. Today's the audition for the Godfather part. My life's already a movie, so when do I start? I walk up in Patsy's East 119th Street. Fat Tony Salerno gets a kiss on the cheek. I know my way around, not my first time here. Been doing overnight cigarette loans for 10 years. I say hello to Danny Pagano and Tough Tony. Nicky Domino gives me a nod, they all know me. They ask why I'm there so early, I say the part. They say what part? I say the movie, why not? I don't look like Carlo, they all begin laughing. 3 p.m. ready for the lights, cameras.
And this is my story.
Before all of the wins in my portfolio, I was a little boy diagnosed with polio.
Welcome, everybody. It's time for another Hollywood Godfather podcast. My co-writer, author, and friend, Mr. Pat Piccarelli is here.
Good evening, everybody.
And we have a very special guest.
We do.
Talking about a very special man in my life. And now that same gentleman that Pat's been writing about, we're going to get some more inside scoop from Ron. And I'm going to have Pat introduce him formally.
Okay, tonight we are very fortunate to have with us Ronald Freed. He wrote a book about Frank Costello, and this is fiction. This is a novel. This is not done often in the writing world, where you take a real character, turn him into a fictional character, or look at the story from a fiction point of view. I just started Ron's book. It is very good, very well written. So without any further delay, let me introduce you to Ron Freed.
Hi, thanks. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's our pleasure. Could you tell the audience first, before we start, who you are, what you do, or what you've done?
What I've done.
We have time for this.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of time, so take
All
it.
right.
Give it to us all.
Then it was 1971, and I grew up on Long Island. I went to Columbia. I majored in English. I always was doing writing. I sort of stumbled into the TV business. I went to work for the Dick Cavett Show on PBS. And
Wow.
I ended up producing many of Dick's shows. I continued to work for him in various iterations of the show for many years. I produced his CNBC show for 3 years. I did a special with Gore Vidal and Dick. And I continued working in television and writing at the same time. So it was sort of two careers at once. My first book was a history of old-time boxing trainers, from like from the teens through about the Ali era. So I was able to talk to Angelo Dundee, and then the people who taught Angelo Dundee how to be a great boxing trainer. And then I also I wrote about a lot of the trainers who were gone, who were dead at that time. It was very cool. I got to meet and interview a lot of people who knew Joe Louis, things like that. So I sort of always been interested in that era of the 20s, 30s, 40s. And
That's
50s.
funny because, you writing a book about Costello. Costello was an avid boxing fan.
I know.
We went to Garden all the time, and he had an extra ticket. He said, "Come on, kid, we're going to the fights."
Right. I was reading about how he bet that Floyd Patterson was going to win one of his rematches. Not Floyd Patterson, Sugar Ray Robinson. So he bet on the fights too, right, Johnny?
Oh my God, yeah. And guess what? One of the guys who was, we can talk about it now. One of the guys that, always denounced the mafia and they had enough information on them and stuff that he didn't want out there was J. Edgar Hoover. And J. Edgar Hoover bet personally with Frank.
Yes. I put that in my book. I said that he didn't want to be seen placing big bet. So Costello would give him the tip, and then he would send Hoover would send his people, which was say FBI agents, to place bets at the track because Hoover didn't want to be seen. And I think at one point Costello said, "I think I spent half my life fixing races for J. Edgar Hoover."
No,
there's a story. I don't know if it's true or not that they, because Costello, of course, was at the Waldorf almost every morning.
I was there.
Oh, I bet you were.
Peacock Alley.
And And he ran to Hoover once, and supposedly Hoover said, "You stay in your lane and I'll stay in mine." I don't know how true that is, but Costello bragged about meeting him in Central Park, et cetera. So yeah, I do believe that. Well, Costello didn't want to prosecute the mob, right? He was interested in going after communists, or what he called subversive, but
J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover didn't want to.
Hoover, yeah, excuse me, I'm sorry, I misspoke. Yeah.
Costello never wanted to.
No, Costello was very uninterested in prosecuting the mob.
So, what made you write a novel about Frank Costello? Did you always have an interest in the mob, or just him?
No, well, a couple of things. So I read after the nonfiction boxing book, I wrote a novel about boxing, and then I wrote another novel which was sort of set in Paris, and so it was completely different. And then two things. One was that I have a friend who's a criminal defense attorney, and he had done many mob cases, and so it was hard to get him to talk about it in any detail, but I sort of got an interest in what he was doing. He's one of my oldest and best friends. And then, but he would come to town sometimes, and he would say he would have a client or an associate, and I would join them for dinner. So I got to spend a certain amount of time with these people who were connected, for lack of a better phrase. I think they were mostly bookies. And some of them were really interesting and really charming guys. One or two of them were sort of scary guys. I was fascinated with them because they were so different than I was. I'm just this guy who
and this all happened in Long Island or in New York City?
No, New York. I moved to the city, and
okay.
I've lived here. I lived in Manhattan since I got out of school. And so, dinner at Rayo's or these other places. And then at the same time, I got a job, a TV job, as a writer and producer on a show called The Making of the Mob, which was on AMC. And that was the history of the mob. So I got to learn all about the history of how the modern day mob was formed, how the five families were created. Right. And I learned a lot. And then I also, in addition to being one of the writers on it, I did the interviews. So I got to interview historians and a few wise guys. So I felt I had a feeling for the milieu, and I certainly knew the history of, Lucky Luciano, Mike Lansky, Frank Costello, et cetera, et cetera. And,
who were the mobsters you interviewed?
Let's say I interviewed Frank Collada.
Frank Collada. Oh my God, Jesus!
I know. I have to say,
how wacko he is.
I have to say, I was talking to this guy, and I thought, this is the worst person I've ever spoken to in my life. And I always joke and say, and I've met William Morris agents. Oh, you like that one? Good. And I really, he made my blood crawl. On the other hand, I interviewed some other guys, and, I interviewed the guy who prosecuted the case, the Goodfellas case. And he was a guy he flipped Hill, right? This was the prosecutor. Right. And he said that he had spent hours listening to tapes of gangsters. And he said, well, one of his ideas was that the most charming ones, the ones who told the best stories, who were the most fun to hang out, were the ones who rose in the mob. Now, you would know better than I do, but what do you think of that?
I totally agree. I totally agree.
Yeah. I thought,
but funny, I had a personal story with Frank Collada. Because when they Tony Spilatro and them showed up in my club, State Street, I would never let them in.
Yeah,
and they really had infamy. So what I did at 6 o'clock in the morning most times, and the sun was coming up in the desert, there was a pizza place that was open 24 hours a day. So I'd take a bunch of people, and it was on Maryland Parkway, right, not too far from my club. And I had these fabulous cars, and this one particular night I had a Coco Rolls Royce, and I didn't park in, vertical like they do in front of stores. I parked it in the middle of the shopping mall. Nobody was there, and we'd have to walk to it. And I had a guy, Ralphie, that I took out of Gene Prison and went through culinary school, and I made him a houseboy. He lived in one of my apartments, and we're walking. Why I'm telling the story. We're walking. He's walking me to the car. He's coming home with me because he lives in the apartment down the hall from me. And Frank Costello comes flying down to run me over and shoot at me.
Huh.
And Ralphie said to me, for what you did to me, I'll take a bullet for you. And I said, hopefully you don't have to do that. This guy, Ralphie, throws me to the ground, takes 3 shots from Collada, gets killed. Collada flies away in the car. Police show, it was a good shootout. Everybody was there in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because you and I are talking about Costello right now. And they come to me and they said, did you see the shoot? I said, no. It's something similar to the, Chin shoot Costello. He said, no. And I didn't even put the two together until you just mentioned Collada. I told you that story, didn't I?
Yeah.
But
well, he was, didn't he turned on Spilatra, right? That was
Oh my God, did he ever flip? Yeah, Jesus.
And he had killed, I think, 9 people. But they let him out of jail, and he's sitting there talking to me. That was.
I know. I can't believe it. Well, it's it's the same thing with and the other guy. I mean, I can't believe this guy, Sammy the Bull. He goes in the witness protection program, goes to Arizona, and he starts a drug ring with his kids. They all go to jail. The state prosecuted him. The federal government said, you can't do it. Just what are you talking about? I'm the governor of the state. This guy's killing students in our school, overdosing. And that's how that all fell apart. And now he's got a talk show. And he killed 23 people. I can't believe this. It's welcome to America.
Yeah, social media. Yeah.
It's amazing.
So, Rob, what made you do this as a work of fiction rather than nonfiction?
Well, when I was working on the TV series, the thing that struck me, Costello seemed like the most interesting character of all these guys. I thought Lansky, I thought was a very interesting guy. Luciano, I thought perhaps less so, but Costello was really interesting to me. He was interesting to me because he was, on the one hand, I couldn't believe how politically powerful he was. I mean, he was.
Oh my God, yeah.
Factor rule of Tammany Hall. On the other hand, he was the acting head of the Genovese crime family. And, so he had to balance these two worlds. And that seemed interesting to me. And I became particularly interested in the Keefe overhearings because all of the other guys, right, they took the fifth. They weren't going to say anything. But Costello says, well, I talked to, Costello has a fundraiser for the Salvation Army. Judges, he's got congressmen, he's got Tammany Hall chiefs, they're having drinks and paying $100 a head. And, there's Vito Genovese sitting at the head of the table.
Yeah.
So it was the two worlds coming together. And I thought, well, why did he testify? And that seemed really interesting to me because he was trying to reconcile those two worlds. But I think that he made the mistake, if you don't mind my saying it, of thinking that he was, because he had a legitimate side and he wanted to be a legitimate person, that these congressmen who were on this brand new thing that nobody understood called television and getting this publicity were going to talk to him man to man, men of power to a man of power. And what he found was that they really wanted to embarrass and humiliate him, and they did.
Oh, yeah, they did.
Do you think that he regretted that decision? Did he ever talk to you about that?
One thing with me, he never talked anything about that. It's so funny. His whole private life, what he did and didn't do, and that's not who we were. And that's and numerous times I would start to say something. He said, "Let me tell you something. I'm not going to talk about that." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because you'd be incriminated, and I wouldn't do that to you." No, the second meeting I had with him, which I thought was very impressive, that he wanted to let me know why he got into this world. And he took an ad out of his pocket when they were building the dam in Central Park. And it was a want ad for laborers. And the WAPs were below the blacks, below the Mexicans, less pay, doing the same job.
Yeah, his father had done that. His father had dug ditches in Westchester. Yeah.
Oh, I know. But my uncle sent his father and mother to America, Angelo Russo out of Sicily. That's how when he asked my name, as after months of coming by and, just giving me money, he never took a ballpoint pen in front of the Sherry Netherlands. He used to come every morning. He'd walk down from the west side, get his shoes shined, and then go over to the Waldorf or wherever else he was going to go first. But he always wound up in the Waldorf. But that he wanted to let me know that's how he got involved, to do good. And that was his whole mission, I guess.
So he was showing you that ad to say, this is where we started from, and I wasn't going to take it, and this is the path I chose.
And that's it. He's like, I felt I had to do something. And they already Sicily already sent Carlo Gambino over, and Carlo was a made guy. They came over to get rid of the Materano family, because when they found out they came over, they were shaking down the Italian immigrants for money and protection. And that's when they created the 5 families. They thought they needed a committee, which, I thought, again, it's the way he wanted it for me to know it. And he named me the kid. He never wanted anybody to know my name. He actually protected me.
Well, he didn't have a son. Do you think he didn't have any children? Do you think he regretted that?
I think that had a lot to do with it. And he loved the fact that once he found out, then he did some history, how I got out of the hospital and I killed the attendant that was a pedophile, basically. And I was 12. So him and Carlo Gambino used to say, the apple didn't fall far from the tree, because I didn't know my uncle was a major killer in Sicily, and I hung him in 1948. So all those elements, but I wasn't questioning it, because every time that guy shook my hand, he had a $100 bill in it. And this is in the 50s, so,
Yeah.
And here I am in his apartment. Yeah.
Did you ever meet his wife?
No, that's one of the things. That was very private to him, and never. She had my number. She's called me sometimes.
Oh yeah.
We just had a conversation, Pat and I, reminiscing even his funeral, because I couldn't go because they were looking for me in New York, and I was in a grammar school across the street.
Across the street from Frankie Campbell.
Yeah. So I was there. Only the reason I went, because I wanted to let her know I did come to pay my respects.
Yeah.
So I had to see her to see what she was wearing.
Yeah.
And I called her because I had the number.
Oh.
And she said, I felt your presence there. It's so funny. I knew you had to be there because you love my husband so much. I said, yeah. And I said, your outfit. And I described her outfit, and she couldn't believe it.
Loretta Geigerman, he married a Jewish woman.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And her brother was involved, right, in New Orleans.
Yeah, and that's why her brother was with Marcellos.
Yeah.
And that gave them credibility with him, with Costello.
Right. And but then I think the brother also ran Frank's gambling operations down there.
Oh, yeah, down there. Oh, no, he did. Oh, no. Yeah. He did. And what's the name? Ran it in Texas.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you ever go to the casino that he ran outside of New Orleans? It sounded very, very
Oh,
ritzy.
yeah. No, I was, well, my life basically in the late, I would say in the 50s, late 50s, after that, I was just a messenger. That's when they were trying to get, because of Joe Kennedy asking them to get his son to become president.
Right.
That's all I was doing. So I met everybody, every mobster in New York and the world, because I was traveling around giving envelopes. He never knew what I was. And the guy was so smart, as you probably know by now. Mm-hmm. When I went to Chicago, I met Sidney Korshak.
Oh.
And that's where they picked me up from there. And Frank, when I found out later on who Frankie Ballesteri was, he picked me up from the airport and brought me to the Obama House. I sat down. I was like 17 years old. He said, you have an envelope for me? I said, yeah. I gave him the envelope. I didn't even know what was in it. I did that all the time. He opened it up and he said, sign here. I signed it, and he gave me a copy, and he signed it. And there was like 10 or 15,000 in it. He took it. He said, now I could talk to you. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, now you just retain me as your lawyer. We have client privileges. I mean, this is how this guy thought. Costello was so smart, man.
Yeah,
Well, you know better than me.
Yeah, well, Sidney Rorschach. I mean, he has a friend of mine's reading his book. He said it's really good.
I'm all through it.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Oh, the outfit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Gus Russo wrote that, didn't he?
Yeah, but I think Rorschach wrote a book. The outfit's different.
Oh,
I think Rorschach, the attorney, wrote a book, or someone wrote a book about him. Yeah.
Oh, his brother, wasn't it? His brother wrote a book about him. There's a couple of books out there. I don't know.
Could be. I'm not sure. So I have another question. I produce a lot of talk shows, so I'll answer questions, but I have a few, if that's okay.
Oh, whatever you want. This is interesting. We came on to question you. Your question to me. Okay.
Well, old habits die. Die fast. Of course, I forgot the question.
Well, that happens a lot.
And you're telling me. I'll think of it, like tomorrow. I'm sorry.
Well, call me back.
So let's get back to your novel.
Oh yeah, thank you.
This is for people who are just listening to this for the first time. They're thinking typical gangster story, and it's not. This is very introspective.
Yeah,
coming from Frank's innermost thoughts. You're looking at it from a whole different point of view, and makes it. I just started it because you just sent it to me.
Yeah,
I got that. Yeah. It's really, really interesting. I mean, you get into his head.
Yeah.
And it sounds like, I've written 2 books with Gianni, and Costello plays a major role in each one of them. And I'm saying this has to be how Frank Costello thought.
Yeah.
Based on what I know about him, which is a lot less than Gianni, but it seems like you got right into his head.
Well, I think I mentioned this when we spoke on the phone. So there were 2 serious literary novels written about the mob. There's one called Billy Bathgate by E.L. Doctorow. It's about a young man, not unlike your involvement with Costello, about a young man who gets involved with Dutch Schultz's gang. And so the story is, he tells the story, he narrates it, right? But so it's sort of the gangster, the mobster, who in this case, a very scary one, is out there, right? And it's the young man describing his experience with him. There's another really good one called Legs by William Kennedy about Legs Diamond, and that's narrated by the attorney, right? So once again, the gangsters out there. So I thought, well, if I'm going to try to write a serious book, and it would be easy for me to write it that way, I pretend that I was you, let's say, but I thought, why don't I try to make the Costello the narrator, and look at it from his point of view? Because what I was trying to get at was what went into this decision to testify in front of the Kiefover hearings. That's how it ended. So there's an epilogue, but it ends with, the famous moment where he's embarrassed, where this sort of, showboat of a New England attorney says, Mr. Costello, what have you ever done to help your country? And then Costello says, I paid my tax. And then they laugh at him. And I thought, it must have been horrible for him. I mean, he was such a powerful man. He was a very, very proud man.
Oh my God.
And these people are laughing at him. And and in a way, it was because he had miscalculated. If he'd just taken the 5th, and not only was it might not have, probably wouldn't have happened. And not only was he humiliated, but it was on television, this brand new thing called television. And it was a complete sensation in New York. So that,
well, they only heard his voice and shot his hands, though.
Yeah, but there's video.
They never saw his face.
There's newsreel of it.
Oh yeah. Oh, was there?
Yeah. So there's the television. They only shot his very nervous hands. It became known as the hand ballet. But there's newsreel of it, so you can actually see it online.
Oh, so, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
So Ron, wasn't he interviewed on camera? And I don't know if it was the tax question or not, but there was a point where he said from now on, you have to just shoot my hands?
What it was that he and his attorney, George Wolf,
Right.
they made the decision going in. So the hearing starts, right? And George Wolf makes the request that they not show Costello's face.
Oh, so he didn't testify on camera at all, his face?
No,
Not on television.
not on
Okay.
television.
Not on television, but the newsreels, which were also taken. So if you look at the photos of that of the hearing room, it's very small, it's very crowded. I don't know who the hell all those people were, and the congressmen are all up here, the senators rather, and it's like he's on trial. And they're saying, "Oh, you're not on trial." The co-feeder says, Keith Overactor says, "I don't want to embarrass anybody." Well, he was there to embarrass everybody. And it's very hot. And there were these, this is years ago, right? So the lights on him are really hot and he's sweating and he's nervous, obviously. And it's a terrible situation. There are two sets of cameras. So there's newsreel cameras and there's the video cameras. And it was seen live nationwide. And
Yeah, it was a live feed going right out.
Right. But then the newsreels were shown in movie theaters, or the TV was projected on the screen, so that people would rather watch the hearings than watch the feature film. It really was a sensation. Bon Motella on 57th Street, where Trump Tower is now, stayed open late. So because women were staying home to shop, were staying home to watch this rather than to go shopping at Bon Motella. So they had to stay open late to keep going. So what I found was, I'm trying to think, well, why did he make that decision? Why did he do that? And what I found is that he loved to talk about himself. He loved to testify. There's a moment early on in the book, and let me just mention one thing about the book. So the idea about the book was that everything that Frank Costello says in public, at the Kefauver hearings, at trials, and in these interviews that he gave to journalists, it's all words that he actually said. So everything that he says in public were his own words. His thoughts in private, what he was thinking when all this was going on, what he might have said to his wife, what he said to his mistress, who lived across Central Park from him. He lived on Central Park West. There was a woman named Thelma Martin, who lived across the way on Fifth Avenue, who was his mistress, who his wife, Loretta, sort of knew about.
That's funny that you mentioned that, because we wrote that. Pat wrote about this in his book.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. I didn't know what you just said. I assumed that he had somebody, but I just envisioned him with a certain type of woman where he could go there and be totally open and relaxed.
Yeah.
Didn't have to talk about business, and they just enjoyed each other. That was my character. I did something similar to you. We just, Johnny and I just wrote a novel, Johnny being the protagonist. And we prominently feature Costello, both when he was alive, and then as the book goes on, he's already passed away. It was 14 years in the future when the book starts to progress. But we had the same thing. In fact, I had this woman living on West 57th Street. Also was an address in the 60s, So
yeah. She lived on literally across the park. So he lived on Central Park West in 72nd.
72nd
Street. Yeah.
And she lived right across the park. It was very convenient. And I read that at one point, he was at the Majestic, which is a beautiful apartment building in New York. He lived on the 18th floor, and it was going co-op or a condo, I guess, or co-op, one of the two. And it was like, I think it was in the 40s, and Costello didn't want to buy it. He wanted to continue to pay rent, but his wife wanted him to buy it. And I think it was 32 grand for this, great big Central Park View apartment. And his wife said, "Well, I know how much money you're spending on your mistress across the way, so you can definitely afford this." So I'm sure it was an excellent investment, right? It was an excellent investment. I know what I wanted to ask Gianni. A psychiatrist. There are stories that he saw a psychiatrist. There's a report in the New York Times that Costello consulted a psychiatrist like Tony Soprano later, right? I think that's where they took it from. And it was reported in the Times. And then in George Wolfe's, whose attorney's memoir, right, he says that the psychiatrist's name was Richard Hoffman, Hoffmann, Hoffman. And there is a moment where at the Salvation Army fundraiser that Costello has, Hoffman is there, and he says and he sort of says, he describes the relationship. He says that he's Costello's doctor, which means that he was Costello's shrink. So I was wondering if you knew anything about that, Johnny.
Nothing about that. No.
No,
My relationship with him, basically, I was a glorified messenger, and then, he wanted me to know nothing.
That's smart. Yeah.
And even, when I used to bring the envelopes to Carmine at night, there was like 4 major spots that I dropped off envelopes and picked up envelopes. And they were sealed.
Yeah.
He was very protective.
Yeah.
And he had a mission for me, and then I realized what it was later on in life, and it worked. But I think like you think, and I thought that for the longest time, maybe just to glorify my relationship. I was the son he wanted to have.
Yeah.
He gave me money to go shopping, and I was like, he taught me so many things.
Yeah.
Can we leave it at that now to go to a commercial, Johnny?
All right, we'll be right back. And don't go anywhere. We know where you live, please.
We are pleased to announce the publication of a new book series from Gianni Russo and Patrick Piccarelli entitled The Sixth Family. When the alleged daughter of Marilyn Monroe asks for help, Gianni Russo becomes entangled in a web of lies and violence in the search for the late actress's diary. Soon, he is enmeshed in a mystery that involves a presidential candidate, a disgruntled mafia capo, a retired NYPD detective, and the past of mafia boss Frank Costello. Russo must race against the clock to stop a hostile reorganization of the American mafia while trying to stay one step ahead of a faceless killer. While listening to this book, skillfully read by Gianni himself, the listener will have to determine what is true and what is fiction. Or as Gianni says before this epic story begins, this book is a work of fiction, except for the parts that are true. Look out for the second installment of this exciting new series coming in 2023, The Sixth Family. Book 1 is available now on Amazon.com.
All right, we're back. You left a commercial break, huh?
No, I'm laughing that line, we know where you live, because so I once had dinner with these guys. They were these bookies, and they were Jewish bookies. They were mob connected, and they were actually very entertaining and funny, a little bit scary. And one day they drove me home, and there were all these parking tickets in the car. And he goes, I don't pay any parking tickets, right? They're sort of typical. And there was a copy of one of these books about the Valachi papers in the back.
Wow, that's funny.
He's going, that's a good book. That book got it right.
Yeah,
and,
Peter Mudd.
So then he drops me off, and the last thing he said to me is, now we know where you live. Getting back, you asked me, I guess we talked about that already, like why do they have a narrator? But one of the things that I thought I could pull off that voice, that narrator's voice, was that I had met all these gangsters, but also when I did the boxing book, I had interviewed a lot of tough guys who became boxers or boxing trainers who grew up in New York, who were born about the same time Frank Costello was born. So I kind of understood how they talked. One of the guys was this guy, Frank Costello, Frank Costello. Ray Arcel, who had trained, I had 12 fighters who lost to Joe Louis. He trained Benny Leonard. and then he trained later. He trained Roberto Duran. But he knew Gene Tunney, he knew Jack Dempsey, and he grew up in Harlem at the same time that Frank Costello did, but he was in the Jewish section.
Yeah.
But he, and I spent a lot of time talking to him. So when one of the figures in my book is Meyer Lansky. So I kind of knew how older, tough, streetwise Jewish men of that generation sounded.
Oh my God!
So I think I have a lot of fun writing Meyer Lansky.
Meyer became a very close friend of mine.
Oh yeah,
For the strangest reasons, but again, because I don't want to mention the guy's name; he's still alive. But Sinatra, who was appearing at the Fontainebleau, Meyer promised this gentleman that his son will be at his bar mitzvah. Don't worry, Frank will come. So now I'm living at the Fontainebleau under the name of Dr. J. Adams, because I knew all the Jewish girls wanted their parents wanted them to marry a doctor. So I'd have myself paged every day at the pool, paging Dr. J. Adams, and I'd get to the phone and nobody was there. It was just, and I met a lot of women that way. But the reason so now he calls me and he said, Johnny, I said, yes. He said, Francis is not at Alvin's house. I said, he's supposed to be. He said, well, if you're supposed to be, I wouldn't be calling you. So I went up to the suite, double door suite at the end of the hall, and I knock on the door, and nobody's answering. I knock on the door, and I hear somebody breathing right on the other side of the door. And it was, he married, what the hell was her name?
Mia Farrow.
Mia Farrow. She was holding onto the door and lied to him and said they called off the bar mitzvah. So I knock on the door and I hear her, not know it was her. I said, who's ever near the door, get away, I'm coming in. Because I could do anything I wanted to hear and say nothing to me. So I back up maybe 6, 7 feet and I shouldered the door. It was a double door. She went flying. He comes out with his typical white silk robe on. He said, what's going on? I said, Frank, you're supposed to be across the creek. He said, she told me it was canceled. I said, you don't cancel a bar mitzvah. And he was down there in 10 minutes because he was shaved and everything. He put his clothes and we went over out of respect.
Mia Farrow weighs about 97 pounds, I think.
Oh, not only that, when he got married to her, I'm on 61st Street. He bought the townhouse 4 doors up. It was the most nightmare to me because every time he had a fight, when it come down here, and I said, "Oh no, please." That only lasted, I think, a year. And
yeah,
crazy.
So your writing process, what's it like?
Oh well, this was different, right? Because the other novels I'd written were sort of pulled from my life or my imagination, right?
Yeah.
And which this one was to some extent. But the first thing I did, I had the summer off from my TV gig. I spent the summer reading everything I could find about Frank Costello.
Wow.
And taking notes. And then I was doing other things. And then the next summer, I made a timeline. So it was 4 pages long, single space. So I knew where Costello was, and I knew that I would get it in proper order. Because in the novel...
Chronologically, you wanted it.
Yeah. I just wanted to understand that. I was going to play games with that, but I wanted to know what the real story was. So, because the novel starts when he first starts to get his name in the paper a lot because of this scandal with Aurelio. Aurelio was this magistrate who Costello had engineered his appointment for the Supreme Court of the State of New York.
Through Tammany Hall.
Yeah, so he had the Republican and Democratic nomination, and but Costello's phone was being tapped for a whole thing, which I explained the reason why. Costello's phone was being tapped by Frank Hogan. So when Aurelio calls him up and says, I just want to thank you, Frank. And I will be loyal to you, and my loyalty is unending. And he said, and Costello says, when I tell you something's in the bag, it's in the bag. And that's because he controlled Tammany Hall.
Yep.
He could appoint judges, which was amazing to me. And so that gets in. So Frank Costello, there's no crime in that, right? There's no crime in that conversation. And so Frank Hogan's office, the district attorney, leaked it to the papers, and it was on the front page of the New York Times. This is during the Second World War, but this is big news that this guy who's going to be nominated to the Supreme Court is talking to this gangster, Frank Costello. So then they contact Aurelio, and Aurelio says, I have no idea who he was. I have no idea. And Costello, sort of thinks, okay, well, he's the only person in the world who doesn't know who I am. The only person who doesn't know. So then there's a hearing. They're trying to disbar Aurelio. So Costello goes to testify, and in my novel, he goes to testify, and
this is all in the novel. This is
you
orchestrated it. Okay.
Yeah, and then so I used transcript of what he said at the novel, and he sort of can't help himself. They asked him, do you know all these people, like, Al Capone, so and so, and he goes, yeah, I know them. They're associates, of mine. They asked him, do you know Johnny Torrio, who
Chicago,
very famous guy from Chicago, who had started in New York and then worked with Capone, actually brought Capone to Chicago. So he no, I don't know Johnny Torrio, which is ridiculous because they had worked together during Prohibition. But then he goes, I want to make something clear to you. I also know a lot of legitimate people, but I don't want to mention their names. So he's sort of bragging and making it clear that he's living in these two worlds. So then he sits down and he says, and his lawyer says, you love it, don't you? He says, what? You love to testify. And in a way, that was his fatal flaw, because, and if you go on, so then later on, they can't really get him on the Aurelio thing. They do what prosecutors do, which is if they can't get you, they smear you, right? They smear you in the press, right? So not that Frank Costello was an angel by any means. So they put out the story that he's importing drugs into America, that he's the kingpin. And this is very offensive to Costello, because Costello prided himself in saying that he wasn't a dope dealer. So he wants to sue, right? He wants to sue, but he really is in no position to sue, right? So he has a press conference, and I thought, oh my God, the head of the Genovese crime family is having a press conference. This is a little wacky, because we know that if you're a gangster, you want to stay away from the press, right? Al Capone would talk to the press too, and that did not end well. And in my novel, his wife is always like, "Don't do it. You're going to end up in Alcatraz like Al Capone is." I'm not going to end up in Alcatraz. But then he has this press conference at his lawyer's office, and I found the transcript. So the whole back and forth that's in the novel of things he actually said. But he's asked all these questions that he really can't testify. So that they say, "Were you the slot king kingpin of New York City?" "Oh, I prefer not to say." And he says, "This mafia, I don't know what it is. I don't know what it is." And then all these questions that he can't answer. So it doesn't go very well. But this pattern of wanting to establish that he's legitimate, it continues on and on, so that he gives a very long and really interesting interview to Bob Considine, which is syndicated. I think there were
columns.
Yeah, the columnist is syndicated all over the country, and he's saying, yeah, I was a bootlegger, but I didn't do drugs, and he's denying that there's a mafia, and so he really can't withstand the scrutiny, because there are a lot of things this guy just cannot talk about. It might be self-incriminating, or he's not going to incriminate other people, so he's always put himself in this position, and then the Kefauver hearings come along, and he does it again. He gave other interviews. He was interviewed in Time magazine. He was on the cover of Time magazine.
Why do you think he was doing that to himself? Because it was self-destructing.
I don't know if it was. I think he was conflicted. I think that he felt that with his intelligence and his talent and his charm, because he was really charming when he wanted to be. He could have been anything. But
Yeah, my thought on that, because I've overheard so much conversation with him just by being around him.
Mhm.
And he didn't want to, and I know this for a fact. He didn't want to be known as a criminal.
Yeah.
He didn't want to be known as a criminal.
Right.
You're smarter than that. I got more than these people. I'm not a D's and O's guy.
Yeah.
And that was it. And anytime you gave him a platform, he buried himself.
Yeah. And, he had a pattern. If you go back, so the novel sort of starts with this Aurelio thing, and we go back and we sort of trace his rise, his early days. And then we flash forward, he's making the decision to testify in Kefauver. And then there's an epilogue at the end. But if you go back and you testify and you look at the way he testified in court when he was arrested for a gun, he was lying. He said, I didn't have the gun. And the cop testifies and says, I saw you throw it into the vacant lot, right? And then he says, and Costello said, well, be lenient with me. He says, my wife is in delicate condition, but she wasn't pregnant. So he's always trying these things. He pretended not to really speak English. And most fatally, he lied on his immigration papers. So he lied about, I think he lied about where he was born. And I think he lied, I don't quite remember, but and then the people who testified on his behalf when he became a naturalized citizen, they had lied as well. So when the Kefauver hearings were happening.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. You're talking about when he filled out to become a citizen.
Yeah.
It wasn't his immigration papers because he came in as a kid.
Yeah. So there were lies on, and then when he became a naturalized citizen, he also stretched the facts. And so after the Kefauver hearings, and they convicted him, he did time, right? So they convicted him for what's it called? Sort of not doing, I forget the name of it, but basically not doing what Congress wanted him to do. And then they got him on his taxes. But they also had him on lying on his immigration papers. And so they tried to deport him.
No, they were trying to do the same thing they did to Marcellus.
Right. And that they successfully did to Joe Adonis.
Yep.
He was deported. So he had to spend a fortune. But he was cleared by the Supreme Court, so he got to live out his life in the United States.
No.
But
Costello's affinity to talk to the press because he wanted to convey himself as a citizen. He wanted to put the gangster image behind him. He sounds like a classier version of Paul Castellano, who was trying to do the same thing.
Well, I wouldn't put Paul in that category.
Paul Castellano was trying to portray himself as a legitimate businessman.
Oh yeah, but Paul, I know both these guys well. Paul Castellano, I knew Paul Castellano, other than Western beef, and he was never politically connected like Costello. Costello had everybody.
Yeah, but I mean, he wanted to show that he was a businessman and not a gangster.
Well, yeah, but not, again, to me, I was too close to Costello. Costello was so, I'm sure, Ron, you could attest to that. I mean, what the power this guy had in courts. Tammany Hall, forget about it.
Yeah.
Paul Costello couldn't even walk in Tammany Hall.
he okayed the appointment of the head of Tammany Hall. He controlled clubhouses in East Harlem. So yeah, I mean, he was incredible amount of power. So why was he powerful, right? So the reason he was so powerful were two things. One was after Prohibition, right, which was the bad piece of legislation which created the mafia, right? Because it
made them all rich too.
Made them all incredibly wealthy. So that Prohibition is over. They have all this money. And they used it to curry favor with politicians and with the Democratic Party, which controlled New York at the time. And there were these reformers like LaGuardia who got rid of all the patronage. and Dewey was governor, so there's no patronage. So Frank Costello provided the patronage. He provided the envelopes that went to the clubhouses, that got the people to, to make sure that the voters got out, that he purchased the votes with the money from Prohibition. And the other thing that he had going for them was the threat of violence, right? He said that you had to listen to the people who were talking to these, telling the Tammany people what to do, because they would ask, Costello would ask in a reasonable way, but I would imagine that in the back of their heads was the fact that there was a lot of muscle behind those requests.
Sure.
And, yeah. So it was, it was money and it was greed. It was greed and it was fear. And he used that to take control, to have it in Northbound. In 1932, he and Lucky Luciano stayed at the Drake Hotel during the Democratic nomination when FDR was nominated for the first time. Well, what were they doing there? They were sharing a suite with the head of Tammany Hall. It's an amazing. So I was astonished to discover how politically powerful he was.
Yeah.
Well, the name of the book is Frank Costello, a novel by Ronald Freed, assuming it's available wherever books are sold.
I sure hope so.
There you go. We thank you very much for coming on our show. It's been enlightening.
Oh, it's a pleasure to talk
Thank
to you. Yeah,
I mean, it's you can imagine what he means to me in my life,
uh-huh.
and I think you nailed it, and I can't wait to read the book.
Oh, great! That's so nice to hear. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear.
Okay, yeah. Okay, thanks, Ron.
Thank you, Ron.
Bye.
Good evening.
You too.
And that was that. But I'll be back.
Thank you for tuning in to the Hollywood Godfather podcast. You can contact Gianni Russo or Patrick Picciarelli with your questions and comments through the contact section of our website, HollywoodGodfatherPodcast.com, which is where you can also subscribe to our weekly newsletter. You can also call and leave us a message at 646-776-3038. Remember to follow us on Instagram at Hollywood Godfather and on Facebook, as well as leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. We'd like to know what you like about what we're doing, what you'd like to hear in the future, and anything else you might suggest to improve our podcast. Most importantly, hit the subscribe button. We'll be back next week with stories of the mob in Hollywood, as well as answers to your messages. Good night.
My kids still can't believe I sat with a saint. My life's like scenes out of a movie. I'm the Hollywood Godfather, truly. I got stories with them all. Celebrities, world leaders, icons. Who knows what's next for me? I'll never get too old to have a little fun. Come on, I'm Gianni Russo, a genuine one of a kind. What a ride it's been, this life of mine. And I ain't done yet. I'll be back. Until next time.
And that was that.
When I was 17, it was a very good year. It was a very good year for small town girls and soft summer nights. We'd hide from the lights on the village green when I was 17. I didn't mind waiting